Right. Now, this slide lists down a few popularly used lock-in mechanisms. So I'm not going to go through each and every one of those mechanisms. I will pick a few and explain a few that might not be quite familiar to you all. But you all can do your own readings on lock-in mechanisms in order to expand your knowledge on this area as well. Right. So first, one of the mechanisms that we have listed out is spare parts and maintenance. Now, when it comes to this area, spare parts and maintenance, we know that if we take a car, for instance, or a special machinery, equipment, so availability and dependability on spare parts is crucial, right? It must be easy for an organization to obtain spare parts and to keep this machinery, this equipment running in that regard, right? So sometimes companies may have separate stores of their own, which are dedicated for the spare parts relevant for those kinds of machinery, equipment, vehicles, and so on. And also they may have certain skilled employees, skilled personnel who are, having a contract with those companies to provide the necessary services in the case of a breakdown or in the case of a repair or any other requirement like that. So for all of this, for obtaining labor, for obtaining these spare parts and all these things, it costs money for the users, right? So this eventually leads to a system where a lock-in takes place, right? A lock-in takes place, and because now if that piece of machinery or equipment or vehicle can only use that dedicated piece of spare part or that kind of equipment, only can depend on that kind of spare part, then they have no option but to go for that spare part, right? So it's inevitable that they will have to incur that cost. So in such a case, they will not think of switching to a new supplier when there is an existing proper system which is in place to provide the necessary compatible spare parts that these organizations need, right? So that is one technique that organizations abundantly use in order to create lock-in mechanisms. Then when it comes to incompatibility and compatibility, what does that mean? Now, this I will explain using the software industry, right? Now, this means that a new version of a particular software should be able to smoothly operate with earlier versions, right? So that means the software is compatible with the older versions, right? Now, in many kind of software protocols, right, the first information in the format is their version number, right? The version number. So this version number allows the computer to switch to the appropriate software when working with different programs, right? So compatibility is important to avoid any undesirable or unnecessary or unwanted type of locking, right? Now, for example, if I tell you some instances of backward compatibility, for example, take Microsoft products such as what? Windows, right? Microsoft Windows. Then application softwares provided by the package, Microsoft Word, Microsoft PowerPoint, and so on, right? So these Microsoft products and the mobile phones, right? So the backward compatibility of Microsoft products mean that Microsoft product is beneficial for users of computer systems because there is a guarantee that these types of products are compatible with the mobile versions that are being used abundantly, right? So by this technique, of course, Microsoft products are made more attractive, and a lock-in is created to these devices with the Microsoft products such as Windows and Word and Excel and so on, right? So this backward compatibility of mobile phones becomes a huge benefit for network operators and also for the users, because they can smoothly create their network, build their network, incorporate in the new technology, and the user is not required to go and purchase a new type of phone to continue to use the same network, because they are backward compatible. Devices are compatible, right? So that excuse me. So that is an instance where this incompatibility and compatibility comes into play, right? Then if we consider training, right? This is also very similar to the context that I explained to you regarding spare parts. Now, when a new system is being built, for example, let's take an aeroplane, right? An aircraft. So this will need a lot of training of staff in order to perform the operations and maintenance activities properly, right? So in this case also, lock-in mechanisms operate in place where when you provide training and train a particular staff to work on a particular piece of equipment or a product or a service, right? There creates a lock-in mechanism, creating a market share there for that particular product, let's say the aircraft, because the users may not think of switching to a different supplier because the current supplier has a staff that is trained so very well to serve their particular needs when it comes to building the system or when it comes to maintenance work or so on, right? Then if we take this potential loss of information, right? Potential loss of information. It is a situation like this. Now imagine if an organization decides to switch or change its existing platforms of computers, sometimes the newly introduced system may not be compatible with or may not support the old version of the software. Now, this could lead to some sort of information loss, right? Or else a lot of work has to be undertaken in order to recover the information or to convert the older version to the new software that is being installed or introduced, right? So, because of this fear, because of the fear of loss of information, there might be a lock-in situation created in such scenarios, right? So that is also one way how lock-in is operationalized by business organizations, right? Then if we take investments and economic lifetime, what happens there is, now think of a situation like this. Usually, if we take expensive equipment used in an organization, they have, we say, substantial technical and as well as substantial economic lifetime, right? And they cannot be replaced unless we incur a huge cost to do so. So then what happens is the manufacturer of the system can earn money on maintenance work and upgrading work if there are some sort of malfunctioning. So for all these purposes, the manufacturer of this system, this equipment system, has the sole control over the maintenance of this kind of long period running machinery. Right now, for example, if you take telecommunication equipment, right? So they have usually a very long equipment life, and it is coupled with a lot of expensive training as well as expensive maintenance work, right? And this can act as a lock-in for network operators over a long period of time, right? Over a long period of time, they secure the lock-in for those kinds of networks, operating telecommunications networks, right? Now, since there's only just two left, I will anyway explain to you these two as well. But you can do your own readings on this as I mentioned at the beginning, right? So now if we consider difficult to terminate contracts, what does difficult to terminate contracts means? Difficult to terminate means it's not easy to put an end to those contracts, right? It's not easy to conclude such contracts easily. So sometimes certain service suppliers can impose penalties, right? Penalties on customers when they're trying to terminate a contract, right? For example, loss of interest on savings, right? So you may have even sometimes heard of this or experienced this. And these types of things are usually practiced by the banks, right? So if you try to close off a loan facility early, right? Or let's say if you are trying to terminate an agreement with a bank, sometimes you may have to do some sort of a payment in return as a penalty for closing of the contract earlier than the expiration of the contract period, right? And also sometimes in certain cases, employees, right, when they leave, if those employees are undergone some sort of a training and learning procedure sponsored by the organization, then the organization may impose a penalty on that employee for leaving before that employee is supposed to leave, right? Before the expiration of the contract period, if a particular employee leaves the organization, in lieu of that, usually organizations may charge some sort of a penalty, right, in return. So that is how lock-in is created by difficult to terminate contracts. Then if we consider loyalty programs, what happens in loyalty programs now? This is very much, I think, self-explanatory to you as well when you see the word. Now, loyalty programs are used by many organizations to stimulate customers to use their service rather than using a competitor's product. It may be a hotel, maybe airlines, right? Maybe retailers and so on. They have their own loyalty programs and even some club memberships which entice or which encourage customers to stay connected with those organizations rather than moving to a different competitor to obtain the same service, right? Now, providing special promotions, special discounted prices, sometimes special products, right? Or one-to-one marketing campaigns, let's say value-added customer service. Through various mechanisms like this, often organizations try to keep the customers locked into their organization, right? So now these are some of the lock-in mechanisms that we abundantly observe in day-to-day life, practiced by most organizations. You can also think of what sort of lock-in mechanisms can be there in addition to these, right? So moving on, now we come to a different subtopic, 2.7, mergers and acquisition. Mergers and acquisitions. Once again, you may be familiar with this topic earlier in certain management studies modules that you have studied, right? So what is the purpose of mergers and acquisitions? They are a way of enabling companies to grow. It's a growth mechanism that can be followed by companies. So what happens in a merger and acquisition? In this case, the company buys or merges with its competitors, suppliers, or other relevant businesses to form a larger company. So the company have the ability of combining themselves with one of its competitors usually, or maybe with another business that is relevant or related to the organization's operations, right? It may not always be 100% related, but in some way it can be relevant to the business. So in doing so, they form a larger company. So this scenario is being illustrated in figure 2.15, right? In this figure, you can see company A is there, company B is there. So company A, through a merger and acquisition, right, they combine together to form company A plus B, right, forming company A plus B. From a business perspective, there is little difference between a merger and acquisition. So when we consider merger and acquisition, from a business point of view, one might tend to think that there is no big difference between the two, right? Why can someone tend to think that way? It is because in both of these scenarios, the outcome is that a company with joint assets, employees, and a customer base from the merged or acquired company. This is the end result, right? Company formed with joint assets, joint employees, and a combined customer base, which has been created by the combination or the merging of acquired companies, right? So due to this nature, sometimes very little difference can be observed between mergers and acquisitions when it comes to real life, and one might think, right? So now these can also be viewed as integrations, right? Integrations කියන්නේ එකතු වීමක් කියන එක නේ, ඒකාබද්ධ වීමක්, සම්බන්ධ වීමක්. So these mergers and acquisitions can be also seen as a way of integrating. So you may have heard, now integration can happen horizontally or vertically, right? So these are the two types of mergers and acquisitions that we abundantly observe. Mergers and acquisitions can be classified into two: horizontal integration and vertical integration. Now, what happens in horizontal integration is that a company merges with another company or acquires another company within the same market segment. Within the same market segment. For example, if we take the Facebook acquisition of WhatsApp, it happened within the same market segment and it can be classified as a horizontal integration. Then there can also be vertical integration. Now, in vertical integration, the intention is to capture a larger part of the company's supply chain, right? For example, in vertical integration, as an example for vertical integration, we can provide the acquisition of HTC's parts by Google in 2017, right? So this is where you try to create an integration along the company's supply chain, right? So these are the two forms of mergers and acquisitions that can be abundantly observed in the society. Now, why do companies undergo mergers and acquisitions? What is the motive or the intention behind mergers and acquisitions? There can be so many, right? Here we have listed out a few. Maybe to get rid of a potential competitor, right? To reduce their power or to move them away from the market, or maybe to increase the user base or to increase the consumer base, right? When the customer base of two companies are combined together, then ultimately an increased customer base can be accessed by the merged company. Then it can be with the intention of increasing the market share. Also maybe to increase the revenues, maybe to expand the company into new technologies. If a particular company does not have access to exclusive technology that is owned by another company, that company can be benefited by approaching into a merger and acquisition arrangement with that company so that they have better access to advanced technology or exclusive technology, right? Or maybe to acquiring new skills, for example, and also technologies. Then, like I mentioned earlier, we can either expand our current technology or the currently used technological procedures and that knowledge by joining with another company, by integrating with another company, or we can acquire a completely set of new skills, maybe employee skills, right? And also new technologies can be acquired, which can be utilized to better serve our customers. So startup companies usually engage in these kinds of practices because they need access to better technology and they need access to resources, right? So due to their inexperienced nature, sometimes they may enter into mergers or acquisition agreements with other, perhaps more experienced organizations in the same industry. Then perhaps this can be done with the intention of expanding into new market segments in itself, right? And then developing a promising concept. In order to develop a better, more promising concept, a more promising value to the customers, companies can enter into mergers and acquisitions. And also with the intention of acquiring access to patents. If there are specialized patents owned by other companies, in order to gain access to such patents, organizations may enter into mergers and acquisition arrangements, right? Then moving on, here it says, in the digital economy, there have been particularly many mergers and acquisitions as shown in table 2.3, right? So here we have listed out a few popular mergers and acquisitions that happened down the history. For example, here now we have given the company and what the notable acquisitions made were, right? Apple acquisition of Beats Electronics, then Google acquisition of YouTube, Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp, Microsoft acquisition of LinkedIn, eBay, Skype. So you all can read and see there are interesting stories behind these mergers and acquisitions as to why these companies entered into these agreements and what was the result of these mergers and acquisition, right? So it's interesting if you can read and see after the acquisition, what was the transformation that took place within these newly formed organizations. Did they get access to better technology? Did they expand their customer base, or did they made their business process more efficient? Was that a result? As a result, did they deliver better value to customers? Right? What happened to their market share? So you can read and see. There are some interesting stories and case studies on these acquisitions that are freely available on the internet as well. Right? So when you get a free time, read them and see. Then finally, figure 2.16 shows examples of various types of integration in which a social media company performs 3 types of integration, right? So in the next figure that we are going to see, different types of integrations are being illustrated where a social media company is said to have 3 types of integration. Now here, an example has been shown for horizontal integration, and then vertical integration. Now vertical integration once again can be divided into backward vertical integration, forward vertical integration, right? Now what is shown by this dark gray color spot or the dot is a social media company. Then the white dot represents companies to be integrated. right? So the social media service, when it comes to horizontal integration, what did we say? It combines with, or it integrates with other companies that are, how did I explain it? Can you remember? It integrates with other companies that are in the same market segment, right? Same market segment. Now, for example, social media service here, you can see in the same market segment, acquisition are being made, mergers are being made. Now, when it comes to backward integration, I told you now vertical integration happens along a supply chain of the organization. It can happen backwards or forwards along the supply chain. So this is an example of backward integration where social media service gets integrated with data storage companies, internet service providers, right? So this is an example of backward integration. So the social media service, in order to provide their service to the customers, they need these back-end participants of their supply chain to provide this service. So instead of obtaining their services for a fee, they integrate with these companies to form one large company, right? So if we look at forward integration, from your company, forward integration is the end of the supply chain where your company and the end of the customer, right? Your company's end and your end customer's point are being covered or integrated, right? That is the forward part or the front part of your supply chain. So in forward vertical integration, what happens is social media service integrates with the e-bank service. E-bank service. Sometimes when providing these services, when engaging certain transactions, users may have to, couple up with some sort of a banking service, right? So instead of getting their service separately at a fee, the social media service company may think of integrating with this kind of a banking service so that an integrated service can be provided to the customer, right? Now here, the acquisition of, as I told you earlier, for horizontal integration, Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp. So that is an example for horizontal integration. Facebook, WhatsApp, all these things are coming under social media platforms, right? So in the same segment, you make an acquisition, right? So now the Google's purchase of HTC, right? Google's acquisition of HTC is an example for vertical integration that is shown here, right? So with that, we have come to the concluding point of today's section, and that also concludes chapter 2 for you. So today we talked about several new areas. We talked about positive network effects and positive feedback, right? Under that, we talked about positive and negative network effects. We talked about positive feedback. We talked about direct and indirect network effects. Then we moved on to talk about same side and cross side network effects. And also we moved on to a new area, lock-in and switching costs. And we defined these terms, what is meant by these things. And also we looked at a few mechanisms that organizations usually follow for lock-in, for creating a lock-in with their customers, with their users, right? And it can happen backward as well, right? You have to keep that in mind. Then we, as the concluding subtopic, we started discussion on merger and acquisition. We talked about types of mergers and acquisition and examples for a few mergers and acquisitions, why organizations tend to engage in mergers and acquisitions, and finally, we illustrated it through this diagram, right? So I hope this section is clear to you, and that the chapter number 2, the content we discussed in chapter number 2 was clear to you. Okay, then I invite you to join with the next lecture, chapter number 3. And thank you for joining with this lecture, and have a nice time. Stay safe, everyone.